All right, here's some examples of how to simplify your trigonometric expressions or identities. So this is number 3 on your green paper. It says sine of x is times cotangent of x, and I want to simplify that as much as possible. When you're doing this, you always want to take any trig function that is not already sine or cosine, and you want to change it into sine and cosine if possible. And cotangent of x just happens to be equal to cosine over sine. So I'm going to replace cotangent with cosine divided by sine of x. This is one of your quotient properties or identities. And I have sine of x times that. So notice that sine of x is in the top, sine of x is in the bottom for where the cotangent was. So those are going to cancel. I have one in the top and one in the bottom, so they cancel. So sine of x cotangent of x simplifies all the way down to cosine of x, which on your paper just happens to be q. You're going to mark off Q, and then on the back, when you go do the dot to dot, you're going to connect 3 and Q on the back. Okay, second example, this is problem number 9. It says cotangent squared x divided by cosecant x minus 1, and we want to simplify this down. This would be the one exception where you're not going to change it into sines and cosines, because cotangent squared x is one of my Pythagorean identities. And that particular identity says that cotangent squared x is equal to cosecant squared x minus 1 divided by cosecant x minus 1. Hang on just a minute. Okay, so cosecant squared x minus 1 actually factors into, this is a difference of two squares. So when I factor cosecant squared x minus 1, that becomes cosecant x times cosecant x. And then the minus 1 at the end is 1 times 1. And because it's a difference of two squares, one of them is plus, and one of them has the minus. So I end up with, on the top, I have cosecant x plus 1 times cosecant x minus 1. Now on the bottom, we still have cosecant x minus 1. This is just like when we were doing rational functions. The denominator has to be exactly like one of the pieces of the numerator, and it just happens to be cosecant x minus 1 in the bottom, and we have a cosecant x minus 1 in the top, so they cancel. So my final answer is cosecant x plus 1, which corresponds to u. So 9 is going to be connected to u, the letter u, not you as a person. Crazy. Alright, next problem, number 17. We have 1 minus secant squared x minus tangent squared x. Again, when I see these squares in the problem, that makes me think Pythagorean identity. If I see a 1 hanging around and I see secant squared or tangent squared or cosecant squared or cosine squared or any of those squared, and I see a 1 hanging around with it, or I see 2 of them squared, subtracting or adding, then I'm going to think about looking at my Pythagorean identities. And it just so happens that secant squared x minus tangent squared x is one of the Pythagorean identities that's been rearranged a little bit. And it just happens to be equal to, you guessed it, 1. So I have 1, and I'm subtracting 1. And what is 1 minus 1? That's right, it's 0. So 1 minus the quantity secant squared x minus tangent squared x is equal to 0. So that one's done. That just happens to be the answer O over there. So 17 is going to connect to O. Last one, number 23. We have sine x minus cosine x divided by sine x cosine x. Now in this one, you'll notice everything is already in sines and cosines. So what I'm going to do with it is I'm going to separate it into two pieces. So this is going to become sine x over sine x cosine x. So I'm taking the first part of my numerator, putting it over the denominator, and then I'm taking the second part, separated by subtraction. The second part is cosine x, and I'm putting it over the denominator, sine x cosine x. Once I've done that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take and simplify. Notice everything is multiplication in the numerator and or the denominator. So this sine of x up here in the numerator cancels with the sine of x in the denominator on that first fraction. Because the numerator totally cancels, I'm going to put a 1 up there to hold that spot open. So I have 1 over the cosine of x for my first fraction. Second fraction, separated by subtraction. Cosine x cancels with the cosine x in the denominator. Because the numerator cancels, I'm going to put a 1 up there to hold that spot open. So now for my second fraction, I have 1 over the sine of x. And it just so happens that 1 over cosine x is equal to secant of x. This is one of our reciprocal identities. And 1 over sine of x just so happens to be equal to cosecant of x. So my final answer, now that I have simplified it down, no more fractions, I have secant of x minus cosecant of x. And that would correspond to M as our answer. So M is going to pair up with 23 on the back where you were doing your dot to dot. So go ahead and pause, rewatch, whatever you need to do. Just make sure you finish up your green paper and finish up the picture on the back. Have a good day. Bye-bye.